Now, when we look at the movie, the kind of the surprise is that it isn't a Roy Rogers movie. It's a wonderful movie that Roy Rogers is in that reflects quite a bit of 1970s sensibility and not what you would consider Roy Rogers sensibility.
From the Autry Museum, located on Tongva Homelands in Los Angeles, California, join us in asking, what is a Western? Welcome. I'm thrilled to host this conversation as part of our What is a Western series today. I'm talking about the film Mackintosh and TJ from 1975, which isn't remembered as widely as it should be, I think. And so it's exciting to get to revisit it today. I'm an associate curator here at the Autry, one of the history curators and the pop culture curator here.
Novelist and screenwriter and I guess film historian, Courtney Joyner, and I'm here in Los Angeles.
My name is Stuart Rosebrook. I'm the editor of True West magazine, and I'm a historian of the American West, including film in the Southwest, and also an author.
And I'm Larry Mahan, an ex-bull rider, bronc rider, and was very proud to have a part in the Mackintosh and TJ film. What an honor and what an experience that was.
So let's talk about Mackintosh and TJ. I don't know, Courtney or Stuart, do you want to, or actually all of you, do you want to give a little background on what you know about how this film got made and what the history behind it is?
Really, this was a project that was initiated by an independent producer, Tim Penland. He wanted, I guess, really to do what he felt was an older style Western. He had quite an extensive Christian background, and he wanted to kind of get away from what he saw in Westerns. There was too much violence and things like that he didn't really like, and wanted to do something that he thought was a little more in line with his own values. And interestingly, though, the first person that he brought on board was the writer Paul Savage, who was a television writer with unbelievable background, though, in Westerns, going all the way back to Wagon Train in the Big Valley and a lot of episodes of Gunsmoke. So he was just the perfect man to sit down and write this. And of course, they were really very much thinking about Roy Rogers. I think now when we look at the movie, the kind of the surprise is that it isn't a Roy Rogers movie. It's a wonderful movie that Roy Rogers is in that reflects quite a bit of 1970s sensibility and not what you would consider Roy Rogers sensibility. So it's special in that way, I think.
Stuart or Larry, do you want to add anything about sort of just the background? Larry, how did you get involved in the film?
Well, I had become a member of Screen Actors Guild. In fact, I have been for about 50 years, but I had just little parts here and there. And when somebody I can't remember who it was, contacted me about being in a movie that Roy Rogers was in. I mean, I was so excited that, well, I grew up watching Roy on the silver screen in Salem, Oregon. And I still watch him on RFD TV now, and they have the old Roy Rogers movies. But I believe this was the first movie that Roy worked in where he wasn't Roy Rogers. Now, I could be mistaken, but when I first moved to Texas back in 1969, I lived on the Phillips Ranch in Frisco, Texas, and Miss Ann, who was the owner of the 4-6s, was married to Mr. B.F. Phillips. So my history goes back with the Phillips and the 4-6s quite a few years. And so over the years, I had an opportunity to be invited out to the 4-6s for different gatherings. And that was one of the and it still is one of the all-time historic ranches in this country. You know, to me, it's when you talk about ranches in the world, I think of the 4-6s, I think of the King Ranch and the Pitchfork and some of the great old ranches that are still around. And when they said that there's this little part in here where you can be a cowboy, I said, well, I'm not sure I can play the part or not, but it was just, again, so exciting to know that I was going to have a part in that movie. And Clay O'Brien Cooper was 13 years old. And I think he had worked in the Cowboys with John Wayne, and he was already totally hooked on the rodeo game as a young team roper. And I do remember that on the set one day, he had qualified for I think it was the AJRA, American Junior Rodeo Association finals down the road in, I believe, Snyder, Texas. They didn't want him to go because they was afraid that something might happen to him. He was so disgusted. I remember him saying that this would be the last movie I ever worked in. And I believe it was. And then he went on to become I can't remember how many times world's champion team roper, one of the all-time greats, and in my mind still is. So he went from the movie business back into the rodeo arena, and in his mind and mine, he did the right thing. He's done so many great things for so many people. A very young, spiritually oriented young man, was then and is now, and he's still going strong.
You know, I really was very reflective in watching Mackintosh and TJ. Very nostalgic for me from a variety of perspectives. The fact that just a few years before that, my late father, Jeb Rosebrook, was the screenwriter of Junior Bonner. And we had grown up with so many of the elements in the film, being about the same age as Clay O'Brien. And of course, growing up with Roy Rogers and Gene Autry. One thing my father made sure was that as soon as I got up in the morning, if I was up too early, he had me either outside or he turned on Roy Rogers and Gene Autry and the Lone Ranger and Cisco Kid. And so watching the film, you can really understand why Roy Rogers wanted to make this movie. And the cast that was attracted to work with him, including Larry, you knew why these men and women wanted to make the movie with Larry, with Roy Rogers. And also the fact that the directors and producers in those days were taking their pulse on America. I mean, we see a lot of urban films being made at the time, great actors, just like Steve McQueen and Junior Bonner. The next film he makes is The Getaway. But that juxtaposition is being played out in the 1970s. My disappointment in watching the film is that we didn't get to see Roy in more Westerns afterwards, and that it possibly didn't become a television series. It would have it was a great pilot. And I don't know if you picked up on it, Larry or Courtney, but if you go back and watch Junior Bonner, to me, Roy Rogers' character, Mackintosh, seems to be an amalgamation of some of those characters we saw in Junior Bonner, J.W. Coop, Honkers, men out of time, men who have values, who still follow the code of the West. And so that message came across very strong, that this code of the West is still very important.
Well, I think that's one of the great things in the movie itself is, and it's very cleverly done, is that Roy Rogers is dropped, if you will, into this situation where he is the top hand, but he is surrounded by kind of, things that don't fit his moral code. And he is the voice of reason and, behaving correctly and living a straight life throughout Mackintosh and TJ as the teacher to Clay O'Brien, and his reaction to things like what's going on with the Andrew Robinson character, or how Billy Green Bush treats his wife, and even in things like the bar confrontation with Luke Askew, which are very modern scenes, but Roy stands his ground and says, no, this is the way that a person is supposed to behave, not the way you are. This is the way. And I think that was very important to him while he was making the movie.
I definitely feel that was Roy Rogers. And that was what he stood for, and that's the way he was. He believed. He was a believer.
There's an aspect of this where it's almost works as a documentary of that moment in time and that region of Texas. Are there other films that you see as a sort of tradition of this, these kind of Westerns that are about right now, whatever that right now is, whatever that moment is, that you see this kind of fitting into a line of Westerns like that?
I were to go back a couple of years prior to Mackintosh and TJ, I worked on a documentary called The Great American Cowboy, which was basically the rodeo game during my time. And it revolved around an all-around championship race between a young man in South Texas, Phil Lyon, and myself. I had won 5 all-around championships and was going for number 6. It really covered rodeo and to move it ahead in time. And I was so blessed because when they did The Great American Cowboy, it won an Academy Award for the best feature-length documentary. And that opened a lot of doors for me. And I really feel blessed that I had an opportunity again to have some parts, little parts in movies. And one of my favorites was Mackintosh and TJ, because again, Roy Rogers was the hero, well, my hero and the hero of so many in this country at the time. And it's been amazing to watch how the movie industry has gone from people like Roy Rogers that had such an important story to tell and life that we should be thinking about living. It has such an influence on young people. And I think that has a lot to do with some of the problems that we have in this day and age. I don't know if that makes sense, but it's just amazing to think that Roy Rogers lived his life and walked that line of being on the right side of spirituality that I think affected so many people, me being one of them. I mean, it took a long time for a lot of it to sink in, but he was such a role model for so many of us young guys that wanted to be the cowboy types.
Larry, I was going to say, if you don't mind, I think you're being just astonishingly modest, which is, of course, part of your character. Your status in the world of rodeo, I mean, you are on the mountaintop with Casey Tibbs and Ben Johnson, and that just adds so much to all of these movies that you were involved with, including, of course, Mackintosh and TJ, and bringing it always, whether, this sense of, if you will, the working cowboy reality that so many people have never experienced. In fact, even for a film about a ranch, in a modern day ranch, I think this is the very first time on screen I'd ever seen a ranch house. They almost never show that. They don't show how the working cowboy eats when he's employed, or any of those things. And this was all part of Mackintosh and TJ. And I think that's another reason the movie is so special, because it did go to that reality.
You touch on something really strong there, Courtney, and that is the fact that the director of the film, the writer, Roy, the producer, and the actors, like and men like Larry who signed on, realized they weren't doing this in Los Angeles. They were going into the heartland. They were going to film it where everyone lives and works, and attempts on a day-to-day basis to make a living and raise a family, live the Western lifestyle of ranching and farming. When I reflected on this film, I know that Rodeo, which Carol Ballard filmed, Larry, that you were featured in 1969, soon after that, they're making movies like Midnight Cowboy, and of course a lot of the urban films are coming out at that time period, and directors and writers and actors were very attracted to these scripts. I know that you were involved, Larry, with Honkers, with James Coburn, who my dad had been involved with in trying to make a movie called Ward Craft. A little background on the rodeo pictures in that era. I know that, Larry, you were such an essential role model and face of rodeo as sports are exploding on television and across the country in the late 60s. And in 1970, my dad's agent calls him and says, "Hey, Robert Redford wants to do a rodeo picture." Now, obviously, he'd seen Rodeo by Carol Ballard. He obviously, Redford was a sportsman. He was an athlete. And he never makes the rodeo picture until Electric Horseman almost 10 years later. But we get Junior Bonner, J.W. Coop, Honkers, Where the Legends Die. And they don't do them in Los Angeles. Like Lusty Men and Bus Stop and the Rounders, they go into the West, into the communities, hire local hands, local people, work with the local ranchers. And I think that that's why these films still resonate. When you watch them, they're real. They're not on a back lot or in a studio. Casey Tibbs, who I'm sure you knew very well, Larry, was very involved in he was very involved in Junior Bonner. And at the same time, you're in New Mexico making Honkers. I'd love to hear a little bit about that, because you guys are bringing rodeo to the world in a series of 5 or 6 films in a 3-year period. People were needing that kind of, they needed to be reminded about the values that they'd grown up with, and it resonated when they went to watch the movies.
I think all of the old rodeo movies you were talking about, Junior Bonner and well, all of them, there was a lot of reality that that people would never have had an opportunity to see as far as what really happens in the rodeo game. And you have the guys that, I was blessed that I learned how to fly and I was winning and I could afford to jump in the plane and go to rodeos, but we still had the guys that were trying to make it, or they had made it and then had gone over the hill and wouldn't let it go. And they had to get to the rodeo any way that they could, some old beat up vehicle. And that was the truth. It is the truth of the rodeo game. Even in this day and age, a lot of these young men they'll put 3 or 4 in a rig and down the road they go, but they're living their dream. I lived my dream, and I think that to me, the rodeo game is it's the showcase for our Western heritage and Western culture. It's been exposed to the world in many different ways. Again, I'm excited that Mackintosh and TJ is going to get out there for the public to see again, because it is a great film. It has a great story about what goes on in the ranch world. There will always be challenges. There will always be conflicts. There will always be good days, bad days. And so many of the young people, even probably more back in those days, came from a ranching or farming environment, and they grew up around the animals, or they grew up, I grew up on a little 2-acre place in Salem, outside of Salem, Oregon, Brooks, Oregon. But my folks knew that I loved horses. Dad had always had a couple, and they really set me on the path, because I fell in love with the horse. It was the horse that brought me into the game of rodeo. And I think I was about 12 or 13 years old. I went to a kids rodeo in Redmond, Oregon. I won $6 in a belt buckle and a calf riding event, and I was hooked on the feeling. So I in retrospect, I look back and say, well, I've been an adrenaline junkie since I was 13 years old. But it just plays such an important part in the development, I believe, in young people. I mean, you set the goal that you want to go out there and be able to win a particular event, or to become a world's champion or whatever. I found that to be so important for me, to learn how to set those goals at an early age. Casey Tibbs and Jim Shoulders and all those guys were my heroes when I was growing up, because of Roy Rogers. I mean, the horse and the cowboy, that was Roy Rogers. The group that I entered the game with was probably the first group that really started approaching it from a very athletic standpoint and from a mental standpoint. I think everybody knew how tough they had to be mentally to go out there and offer yourself in that kind of a dangerous situation in some of the events. That was the game.
Larry, you brought up a really excellent point, and I think it's separating rodeo and that type of sports competition from literally every other sport is rodeo is also a reflection of a lifestyle. Whereas I think so many, what we consider regular athletes, baseball or football or basketball or whatever it is, they play the sport and then they go home and have their lives in a separate way. But I've always felt that rodeo is, in fact, so much, if you will, a part of, if you will, the soul of the participants, and such an inspiration for everyone who's actually going to ride. And I think that's a major difference, is that commitment. Am I just imagining this? I hope not.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. And it's, we can all make a living in this country, but it's about making a life. If we think of the lifestyle that rodeo represents, I mean, my wife and I, we ranch now, we raise cattle, we raise horses, and it's almost like I've made a circle. But at my age now, what a blessing to be able to enjoy the animals and get up every day. And, it's 12 and 13, 14 hours a day every day. But if you love it, you're going to do it. And the animals, they depend on us to be taken care of. When you get on that bull, you don't have somebody negotiating a deal with that bull for more money. So it's, they say, well, you get out of it what you put into it. Not always in the rodeo game. You can put a lot into it, but you might not get out of it what you would expect to get out of it. I mean, we never know. It's the unknown, that element of danger and the element of the unknown that keeps you hooked on the feeling, and knowing that, telling yourself you can do it and being positive about it all. If you're not positive, you're not going to win.
I think you bring up, Larry, there's when I was watching Mackintosh and TJ, it reminded me of one of the great themes of Westerns and Western leading men and how it relates to rodeo, and that is independence. That, it's you. What's that line in Junior Bonner? It's one of you and one of me, as he's talking to Sunshine the Bull. And then, when he's making those choices about family, I think that those films and the documentaries about the Great American Cowboy show that reflection of family behind the cowboy, and then the cowboy who wants to be a rodeo star having to make those difficult choices. but it's not about being dependent. It's about living choosing an independent way of life, self-determined, and a work ethic. And I think all of those things come out in this film that are they're subtle, but they're so strong. As Roy Rogers was a world champion. It comes out at the end. He was a world champion at one point, but that never changed his work ethic and his pride and his determination to remain independent. And I think those are so many of the values that we're attracted to in rodeo, because they're so American. They're truly American values.
Well, I totally agree with that. And the thing that I realized almost after the fact was the independence and freedom that I and many of the other young rodeo guys had during that time. I mean, during the summer months, you'd go to almost a rodeo, and quite often 2 rodeos a day, especially when you were flying from one to the other. You were making decisions and choices all day long. You might be flying to Cheyenne, Wyoming, or leaving Cheyenne to go to a rodeo in Pampa, Texas that night. The weather's bad, but you covered your whole card by entering another rodeo just in case the weather was bad, or you drew an animal you knew you couldn't win on, so you go somewhere else. So you're always rolling the dice, and you have to be able to handle change. And that's one thing that I learned out of the game, when being able to change frequencies, because when I started flying, I realized that, and when I got my license, there would be 2 or 3 other guys flying with me in the plane. I said, well, if I just got off a bull, I was responsible for me. I made the decision to go out there and play that game. But when I left that rodeo grounds, win, lose, or draw, I had to change frequencies and become a pilot, because now I'm not responsible just for me, but I'm responsible for 3 other lives that are going to be in that plane with me. So in my situation, there was a lot of responsibility that goes along with the rodeo game, not so much in the arena. But when I left there and hit the skies like old Sky King, I mean, I had to make sure that I was on my game.
One thing that I think is very important when we think about Mackintosh and TJ and the Honkers and Junior Bonner and When the Legends Die was also the attitude of the country at that time. People were really, really taken with the Western lifestyle and the equestrian lifestyle. And so it wasn't just these movies, it was films like Rancho Deluxe and of course the huge explosion of country music that had never been seen before at that level. And of course we have Waylon Jennings doing the score for Mackintosh and TJ. And of course on television, not only we had the Great Western miniseries, whether it was Centennial or How the West Was Won, but Johnny Cash and Glenn Campbell, and it was kind of this tidal wave of interest in all of this. And that was at the high, and Mackintosh and TJ was done right in the center of when all of this was happening.
You're absolutely right. And of course, I was a real fan of Waylon's music, and then after I was getting toward the end of my rodeo time, I did get into the music world. And this is make it a quick story, but there was a great old music producer, Snuff Garrett, out there in California, and I knew Snuff. And he would invite me over to his house in Bel Air, and he had a theater in there that would seat about 50 people. And he would invite me over to watch Roy Rogers movies. There was 3 of us, Snuff, Roy Rogers, and me. And I mean, that was like being in heaven. And Snuff had just finished Roy's last album. He said, Mahan, he said, you need to do an album. And I had never sang before in my life, couldn't sing a lick. And I said, I told Snuffy that. And he said, no problem. He said, we'll just cover you up with strings. Well, I thought that it was just a throwaway line for him. About 2 weeks later, Snuffy calls me up and he said, man, he said, if you can be in my office on Wednesday, we're going to go meet Andy Wickham. He's the head of Warner Brothers A&R or whatever. And I didn't know what A&R was. And so we go over there, and Andy's a little Englishman. I thought, well, what does he know about country music? And I'm thinking, this guy's serious about this. But I said, I want to go check out this meeting. We go over there, and Snuffy just starts telling him all this stuff about all the stuff I had done and things I hadn't done. I thought maybe he was talking about somebody else. And then finally, Andy gets an opportunity to say, well, I say, Larry, he says, can you sing? And before I can say no, Snuff said, well, if the songbuck can sing, you'd think he'd be riding bulls for a living. Well, Andy breaks up and he's laughing and said, enough said, Snuffy, let's do the project. 2 months later, I'm in the studio scared to death. And if they would run a bull in the chute when I was almost through with my career, it would have been easier than walking in there and standing behind the microphone trying to sound about halfway right. And we did an album called King of the Rodeo, which was fun. Oh, this is it. My wife just handed it. That's me on the front. Haven't changed a bit, have I? What an experience that was. And then Snuffy we're in the studio, and I'd never sang with a band before because they'd already laid all the tracks down. Sandy Pinkard, who was a great songwriter, but he was a young songwriter then and wrote for Snuffy. And he wrote, I tell people my favorite hit song on that album was that Sandy wrote was Rosie's Palace of Pure Love and Fingertip Massage. Well, it was about these two old cowboys that ended up on Hollywood and Vine in California, and it wasn't an X-rated song, but Sandy went ahead to write one of the all-time great West country songs called You're the Reason God Made Oklahoma. Blessed Are the Believers, that I believe Anne Murray made that one into a hit. And then he wrote Coca-Cola Cowboy for the movie. Well, I go back through the years and think about the times that I had an opportunity to meet Roy and how it turned into me getting in the music world. And then I opened for Waylon a couple of times, which was a real treat because he was one of my music heroes. In fact, we opened for him at Red Rocks one time. There's 8,000 people there. And I'm thinking, boy, they're all here to see me. And then when they didn't want me to do an encore, I kind of put everything back into perspective and busted my bubble. But yeah, we'd almost finished an album in Waylon's studio. In fact, we still have some old tapes somewhere that we never did finish. I don't know if I was tough enough to handle that world.
I was wondering what you all might hope for Mackintosh and TJ as it kind of goes into today's world. How might it meet today's audiences who weren't familiar with that world, who are younger, who are from different places, and what do you kind of imagine or hope that it might do in its new release?
I feel it will give people some insights to what the big time ranching industry is all about. And you have the small ranchers that go from year to year trying to make ends meet. And then you have major ranches that run thousands of head of cattle that create, and all of them do, but that's where our food chain comes from. I mean, from the farmers and the ranchers. And I hope that a lot of people, especially young people that think that milk comes out of a bottle that you get at the store, but they have no idea how you get the little piggy to market. So I think that it will, open a lot of eyes. I think it'll be very educational for a lot of young people, especially in this day and age.
You know, Josh, one of the things I think is going to work very well for Mackintosh and TJ is going to be that this is just a wonderful paternal story. And it really is about a man with this young boy, and he's teaching him life lessons. And I think that will actually propel the movie. And I think that's what's going to hook people who may not even be familiar with Roy Rogers.
I'd like to add to that, Josh, I believe it's going to be very validating for multiple generations that sit down to watch it. Before we moved back to Arizona this past year, we lived in Iowa City for 9 years, and we traveled back and forth across the heartland of this country from, one side of the country to the other. And, the further west you go, you start to notice that there's always a rodeo grounds next to the high school football field. This film will really validate a value system, a lifestyle, and families will be able to sit down and watch it together. And it will remind families of who they are, who their parents and grandparents are and were. I think that people will be able to remember who was Roy Rogers. And Roy really should have made more films after this. I was really taken with his role. I think we need more Roy Rogers in the movies today, and more of these films that remind us of what good American life is all about. And it's not always about winning. It's about doing the right thing.
And I think too, unfortunately, I mean, because the film was, if you will, not lost, but did get kind of lost in the shuffle when it was released. So now to have this particular release done this way on Blu-ray, the presentation is the best it has ever been. So when people are introduced to the movie, they couldn't be seeing it for the first time. They couldn't be seeing it better because it's they've just done a tremendous job cleaning it up and presenting it in a way that, frankly, audiences before never had the chance to see it this way.
Don't you think it also got lost? It's 1975. Jaws, wasn't that the big movie of the summer? The next year it's Rocky. The Western is disappearing from television. We don't have kind of the post urban cowboy. There's kind of a renewal of modern Westerns on television and more Westerns, especially modern Westerns in the theaters in the 80s. It really had an uphill battle by 1975 in the movie theaters to gain an audience, which is too bad. It's like Junior Bonner and other films that they were real period pieces. They were made on location. And I think what's magical about these films, this era of rodeo and Western film made on location, is that they really are snapshots of America that remind us of what our values are, of what that time period was, and also allows people to look back and really see themselves. And I think that in family is a very important part to Roy Rogers' career. And in this film, it plays such a strong role. I think, Larry, you could probably comment on this in a much deeper level. The family of the working ranch. That was the other thing that's very interesting about this film, is it gets into the extended family of a working ranch the size of the 4-6s.
It really does. And even the smaller ranches, I mean, the struggles that go along with within the family. I mean, some of the small ranches, those cowboys don't make a lot of money every month. And they still have to put food on the table. But when you have the 4-6s, you have a large organization that's capable of taking care in a better way of their people that work for them. The small rodeo arenas that you talked about in all the little small towns out across America, they're still there. And they play a very important part in the economy of these small towns. I mean, for many of them, that is the big event of the year. And the people that donate their time and efforts without pay to make this happen, that's what it's all about. Everybody works together to have a successful event. And a lot of these events, the little fairs and state fairs and the major fairs around the country, you have all of the FFA and the 4-H programs for these young kids get involved at an early age to find out what the ranching and farming industry is all about. But they also know the amount of hard work and the responsibility it takes to deal with and take care of all the animals that we have and that we raise.
Mm-hmm. Well, in fact, of course, the 4-6s, while you were making the movie, Larry, it was in full operation, and there were things going on every single day while you guys were shooting and kind of shooting around, and you see these spectacular moments with them when they had to move the animals and all that's there. It's all part of the film.
It was, and I remember when they had the big party scene there. I was up at a rodeo. That was my last day on the set or at the ranch, and I was entered the next afternoon at a rodeo in Burwell, Nebraska. And got a couple hours sleep and jumped in the old 310 Cessna and pulled into Burwell about 8 o'clock in the morning. So that was all part of the rodeo cowboy lifestyle. But the ranching lifestyle, those guys might have to load up. They'll be out there at 4 o'clock in the morning finding cattle, load them up and haul them from one side of the ranch to the other. I mean, the 4-6s was a huge ranch. So there's so many different aspects of the ranching industry, and everybody has a part to play. And if they all play the part correctly, you have a successful operation. If not, you make a mistake, you learn from the mistake, and hopefully some people don't.
Yeah, the film doesn't shy away from the tragedies and the bad choices that some people make, but it sort of still holds Roy there as a kind of a compass for everyone else.
And one of the real scenes that I'll never forget is that Roy was getting on a bucking horse, and his double gets on this horse, and this sucker bucks him off, slams his head in the ground, and I mean he lived through it, but he certainly had some injuries there that he had to deal with for a while, and that wasn't just part of the movie life. I mean, that was an accident that happens somewhere daily across the country in the ranching industry. Now, horses, of course, are being replaced quite a bit now with motorized vehicles. In fact, I saw a cartoon years ago that with two old men standing there with their chaps on, ropes hanging on their arms and hats on, and standing alongside a helicopter. And one says to the other, said, "Remember the good old days when we used to gather our cattle on 4-wheelers?" So it has changed, but in certain ways. But the horse and the cowboys still play a very important part in the ranching and the cowboy industry. I don't know how familiar you are with the Cowboy Channel. It's a channel that RFD, and they have brought rodeo to the forefront by televising hundreds of performances of rodeo every year. And they also cover the farming and ranching industry. And it's a very educational program to turn into. It's wonderful. It's very, very good. I watch it all the time. I love it. I think a lot of people will also enjoy seeing what really goes on in the ranching and farming industry. They cover from one end of it to the other.
Yeah, that's what one of the things I picked up in watching the film. It had legs if it had been more successful at the box office. I think that we would have seen more pictures with Roy Rogers. Obviously, Clay O'Brien went on to a great career in rodeo, and he made the right choice there. But he was great. I mean, I think we shouldn't overlook the fact that he's, 15 years old. He's carrying this picture with this veteran group of actors, and he was fabulous. He really was. And Roy knew, because he's a veteran, Roy really knew how to work with him. And that had to be something to watch, Larry, on the set, to see those two work together, because, he'd been working with all these adults like John Wayne, and had just been in the Apple Dumpling Gang. He'd been working with a lot of veteran actors. He was a veteran himself, but he must have really held himself pretty tall on that set, even though he was the youngster.
I think there's an old soul in that 15-year-old kid. He was just amazing. And Roy had such a feel for, I believe, getting the point across on what's right and what's wrong. And I feel that even at that time in Clay's life, he knew what he wanted out of life, and he knew how hard he was going to have to work to get it.
And of course, Clay came actually from, as we know, although his father was a wrangler, he came from television. His dad was a wrangler on Bonanza, and had worked on Gunsmoke, and all. So show business was not a foreign animal to him. Larry, when you talk about choices, Clay had already experienced all of this and was not, if you will, overwhelmed by it. And he made the choice the direction he wanted to go in. And
he loved horses.
Yep.
Horses and the cowboy. That's what he wanted to be involved with, and he took it to a very high level.
I would say, one of the things that also struck me was that, this was this era in which, Walt Disney had dominated the family picture, and was still producing quite a few strong G movies, both on their television and their film division, that went into these topics. I think we also had in that era, was it The Wilderness Family and Grizzly Adams, great G movies. I remember my parents taking my sister and I to those came out. We were there. We were at the box office watching those films. And so what's interesting about Mackintosh and TJ, like the other rodeo pictures from just a few years before, there are some really adult themes in the picture. And even Steven Spielberg had gone out and made Sugarland Express. I think the producers and the studios were trying to bridge this gap from the G Western, the G family movie, to the PG Western. There's some pretty shocking subject matters that are being addressed in this film, which I'm sure that if Roy had worked with the producer and the screenwriter, felt that some of these topics needed to be addressed, whether it was physical violence in the home, and the actor who is the peeping Tom and who hangs himself. Yeah, these are some pretty telling the truth, vagrancy, work ethic. Which side of the law are you going to be on? Service to your country, veterans. How are veterans being treated? There's a lot of heavy topics covered in this film.
If it helps one or two people, that's wonderful. It could help a lot more than that. Could get some people off the bad track and on the right track. So good job, guys. I'm so happy that you've been able to put this together, and the landscape, the photography in this movie is just unbelievable. When I saw it here, in the old version, I said, wow, I'd forgotten how beautiful that country is in the 4/6s. And again, congratulations and thank you, all of you, man, for being involved and bringing this thing back to the forefront.
Well, thank you for joining us. It's really an honor to get to speak with you. And one of the benefits, I suppose, of these Zoom type calls is being able to have you all beaming in from far afield. No, thank you all for joining us at the Autry virtually, and we hope to see you here in person before too long.
Keep up the good work with the museum.
All right, thank you.
Larry, I hope we have a chance to meet in person someday. Really would like to shake your hand and thank you for everything you've done for Rodeo and
thank you. And
all your values.
now we're north of Dallas. If you find yourself coming through Dallas, get in touch and come out, and we'll help you develop some saddle sores.
All right, love to do that.
Put you back in the saddle.
Love to do that.
I'm back in the saddle again.
The Autry Museum of the American West thanks our members and supporters.